Okay. Can you please say and spell your name?
Okay. Claire Potter, CLAIRE,
Great. And to start us off, would you please just give me an autobiographical sketch, and you can be as elaborate or not as you'd like.
Okay.
But your engagement with higher education, the institutions, or at least the kinds of institutions you've been involved with, the kinds of positions you've held.
Yep. First of all, I think there's one thing about me that's really important, which is pre-higher education. I went to the same school for 13 years, and it was a women's school outside of Philadelphia, across from Bryn Mawr College. And so on a certain level, when I was always a college-bound person. And I think that's really important. And I think the fact that even before feminism, I was educated in a feminist atmosphere. All of those old ladies who, for some reason, were mysteriously single, but all lived with each other and studied Greek and so on. So I went undergraduate at Yale. I did a BA in English literature, which I thought was going to be my profession and my field. And I took history classes for fun because all of the people in the history department were so wonderful. So I had lecturers like Jonathan Spence and who else? Howard Lamar. And, just amazing teachers. So every semester I would sort of set up the English classes that I needed for my major, and then I would pick from these wonderful history classes. And I always thought I was going to go on and be a college professor. That said, I worked for the Yale Daily News, so I had this other journalism thing going on, and that was a very real possibility for me. And so when I graduated college, I decided not to go into graduate school right away, because people didn't then. Most people didn't. Except for people who had Rhodes scholarships or something like that. You would go out in the world, you would muddle around, and then apply later. And I actually remember going to talk to the dean of Pearson College about getting some recommendations in the file and who I should ask. And she said, well, what are you going to go to graduate school in? And I said, English. And she said, Claire, don't do that. She said, be a lawyer, be a doctor, do something, but don't do that. And I paid no attention to it. I now kind of look back on that, and it was a moment in which women like myself had so many choices. And the fact that I was so focused on a humanities future must have seemed very limited. It was Rachel Wisner, actually, whose husband was at the law school. She was a lawyer. So anyway, I went and worked in advertising for a couple of years, and I was getting ready to apply for graduate school, and none of this was rational, which is why on a certain level I'm very sympathetic to many of the people who now just rush on to graduate school because they're so in love with it. I was sort of filling out all these applications for graduate school in English, and I suddenly thought, when I was really having fun, I was in history classes. And so then I just switched. I had no idea whether I could get into graduate school in history because I had this BA in English. And I applied to NYU, Columbia, and the University of Michigan for absolutely no reason. Well, here are my reasons. The University of Michigan, because Chuck Tilley taught there. And I was very involved with John Merriman at Yale, and Chuck Tilley was his mentor. And Columbia and NYU, because I lived in New York and I didn't want to move. And so I got into all these schools and decided to go to NYU because it was closest to my house. And so that is all an illustration of the fact that on a certain level, I think had I not had so much cultural capital coming into this experience, I would have failed, absolutely, because I was not taking advice from anybody, and I was sort of making these decisions on a whim. But I think I had a certain self-confidence and as I say, all this cultural capital and economic privilege. My parents were not paying for graduate school, but it never occurred to me that I was going to starve. Or that things would go really badly for me. So I think my engagement with higher education is sort of in a lot of ways conditioned by all of that. To sort of trace an arc way forward, I have never, except as an adjunct briefly when I was in graduate school, taught at a public school. And one of the things I learned when I was on the job market the last 5 years is it's actually very difficult to transition from a private school background into a public school background, unless you do it very, very early, because the perception among people in public universities that private school people basically will not be able to deal with how public universities work, that they're too big, that there are too many hardships. And I remember after I interviewed at Rutgers, I was very interested in a job there. They were interested in me. And people kept saying, but how will you deal with Rutgers? And I would say, well, I'll make friends with the secretaries, and I will, all the sort of networky things that both you and I know how to do. And I said to my friend Jeff Nunakawa, who taught at Princeton, what's going on with these people? Why do they think I can't handle it? And Jeff said, Claire, they don't have phones in their offices. And so you realize that regardless of how we in private institutions look at public institutions, however much respect we have for our colleagues who work there, some of the finest history departments in the country, that there's a lot we don't know about what people are coping with, even if on the surface everything seems fine. So let's see. NYU, it was a weird time to go to NYU because they were very much in transition from a program that mostly trained people to be school teachers. NYU had just sold its uptown campus and moved the whole operation downtown. So it was way before everything that has happened now.
This was in the late 80s?
This was in the early 80s. 1982 is when I started at NYU. And they admitted a whole bunch of us who had these sort of odd backgrounds. It was kind of like getting a bunch of horses that seem to be very sound, but nobody else really wants them, right?
And nobody had seen them run.
That's right. Nobody had seen them run, right? So we had people. One of my colleagues who's now teaching at BU, she had been working for the War Resisters League. My friends Barbara Valier and Elaine Abelson had been in the archives program. They had both come back to school to get a master's degree in archives, and somebody said, you guys should really get a PhD. And Margaret Hunt, who had been off living in a lesbian feminist commune somewhere, just a bunch of very sort of strange group to pull together. But it was great, and it was great. We had some great faculty there, in Danny Walkowitz, Tom Bender, Marilyn Young, Molly Nolan, great people. But it was also great because it was a combination of what graduate school is supposed to be, which is a series of jumps you have to go over, but almost no structure. So we kind of did everything for ourselves. And really, a lot of the things that graduate students and young faculty complain about now, that they didn't tell me this, they didn't teach me that, we didn't get taught those things either. So, Margaret Hunt, who had spent a part of her life with Peg Jacob, who was a big shot even then, even before she went to UCLA. So because Margaret had been living with Peg, Margaret knew how to write a grant. So when it came time for all of us to start writing grants, Margaret sat us all down and said, okay, this is how you write a grant, right? Similarly for applying for jobs. I'm not sure, even though our faculty assumed that we were, I don't know what they thought we were going to do, but nobody ever talked to us about getting jobs. And then at a certain point, Margaret said, okay, this is how you write a job letter. And so we all started applying for jobs, and we got them, And I still think to this day, a lot of the faculty at NYU were just shocked that we were
That this
getting
cohort
jobs.
was actually moving.
Yeah, so we were, I mean, it was just, it kind of blew them away, including, by that time, it was the early 90s, which was really one of the worst job moments. I mean, it's all been bad since the 70s, but that was actually one of the natives. Yeah, it was just terrible. Yeah. So, I would say that my engagement with higher education has been, in some ways, very traditional, but also very DIY. I've kind of experienced every single moment as, okay, let's sit down and figure this out.
Right.
You know.
Good. Okay, I want to come back to some of the themes that you've already mentioned, but let's just to round this out. So then, was Wesleyan your first job?
No, my first job was actually at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, and how long were you there?
I was there for 1 year. I was supposed to be there for 3 years. It was a visiting thing to replace, multiple people on sabbatical. The funniest thing about it was I walked into the interview at the AHA, and I wanted the job desperately because my partner was living in New York, and it was a commute that would work. My father was ill, and my parents lived outside of Philadelphia, so I figured if I was there 3 days a week, I could spend more time with him. So I wanted this job so badly, I can't tell you. And I walked in, and the first thing, there were two interviewers, Rick Beeman and Drew Faust. And Rick Beeman says, well, what you need to know about this job is that we're interviewing you because you will be replacing Carol Smith Rosenberg next year. Now, that was possibly the most intimidating thing anybody ever could have said to me at that moment. And the second thing was, I had no training in women's history whatsoever, and it was a moment in time where there were few enough of us that when they wanted to hire a women's historian, they would very often say, oh, look, a woman has applied for the job. And I got the job. I mean, it was a complete crapshoot, and I got the job. And then what happened is that year, they were authorized to hire someone and had a search, and they invited me into the search. And not being as stupid as I had been when I applied to graduate school, I thought, well, I should apply for some other jobs. Even though I really didn't want to, I should do that, because if for some reason they offered me this, I don't want them to think I'm just sitting here waiting for the offer. And so I applied for a bunch of other jobs, and one of them was Wesleyan, and I got that job. I was the second choice for the Penn job. The first choice was a guy named Brian Ballow, and he went to the University of Virginia. And they said to me, don't worry, if you wait, we're pretty sure Brian's going to go to Virginia, but that has to play out, and it has to play out until about the end of July. And Wesleyan said to me, well, no, you have 2 weeks. We're not going to wait till the end of July, which was fair. I mean, truly fair. And so I sort of pulled myself together and said, well, they picked me first. I should go there. And I did. The coda to that story is they then reopened the search and hired Tom Sugrue. So everything worked out well for everybody. We were all happy. But it was interesting. I ended up picking Wesleyan, and I think this is in some ways more useful to you. I mean, I was very infatuated with the idea of Penn, and living in Philadelphia and being near my parents. And then when I did the interview at Wesleyan, I actually wasn't even going to go, because I knew I would either get the Penn job or a job at Princeton, which I was also a finalist for. And Nancy, my partner, said, no, they've done all this work on the search. You should go. It would be rude not to go. So I'm like, all right, I'll go. So I went, and it was just the most fun time I'd ever had. I mean, it was just wonderful, and it was so welcoming, and the students were so great, and there were so many women in the department. At one point, Wesleyan does these massive interviews in which you're going all day. And I walked into one piece of the interview, and there are, 5 tenured women in the department. I'd never been to a history department where that was true. So, I do think one of the things that people forget about interviews is that a department has a chance to really entice people. And Wesleyan was really, really good at that. And so when it came down to, I remember leaving and thinking, I really hope they don't offer me the job because I can't take it, because I have these other 2 jobs and I'm going to take one of them. And then when it came down to it, because they had done that, it made it possible for me to do that. It's also, it's interesting because that was a moment in time in which, again, I didn't truly understand. If you make a decision to go to a small liberal arts college, that is a career choice that then
Well, I wanted to
tracks
talk to
you.
you about that. Yes, I wanted to talk to you about that. Let's just finish this. So you were at Wesleyan for 20 years?
Yeah.
Or close to that, 20 years?
Close to 20 years, yeah.
And then now you are at the new school. This is your second year.
Actually, I'm rolling into my third
year.
Yeah.
Okay. We can come back to the new school later on, but let's a couple of things I want to pick up on. Well, so you were at Wesleyan in kind of the 20-year period that kind of defined the crisis in the humanities in a certain way. Can you talk about that from the perspective of, kind of on the ground in a liberal arts institution? Kind of how did that manifest itself, and what are what's the trajectory that you observed in that institution?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing, and I don't know exactly where if you're going there, but in the time I was at Wesleyan, college became exponentially more expensive. And loans became de rigueur. Now, for a place like Wesleyan had a commitment. It doesn't anymore, but it did for most of the time I was there, for need blind and for getting students through. They would say, if we admit you and you come here, we will make sure that you will not have to worry about money. What that meant was the assumption on the part of the college that students would take on a loan burden that there was a cap to, and every year Wesleyan talked about where they were capping the loan burden. Sometimes they would be able to bring it down. But when I was there, the loan burden rose from $6,000 or $7,000 to over $20,000. Now, in the scale of tuitions that have gone up from, say, $40,000 to $65,000, that's not too bad. On the other hand, what it didn't count is the other loans that were being taken out. Parents taking money out of their houses. Which, every once in a while someone mentions this as part of the mortgage crisis, but I think it's much bigger than anybody knows because you had to. The financial aid office would make you file a FAFSA, and you'd have to say what your house was worth and what your equity was in it. And, so people would take out home loans to pay college tuition. And I think part of the connection of the crisis in the humanities is not just that parents were saying to their children, you better make this count. But kids understood what their parents were sacrificing to send them. They really did. And, students know a great deal more about what's going on. I think in some ways a lot of them don't get what it means to take on such a huge debt, because how could they? They never have. But they, most of them knew that both of their parents were working. They knew how many siblings they had who were going to be going to college. So I think, one whole frame that we can't forget is the level over the course of several decades that the financing of education has been put on families. And then within families, devolving on individuals, whether that is the student or whether that's the parents, and different families handled it differently. We have friends who sent their kids all the way through and are paying all the loans for their kids. It's a tremendous gift to their children, but it's also has a tremendous effect on their retirement. So I think, part of the crisis in the humanities and the ways in which we're being asked to make everything count and price out everything, what job does this lead to, is not just neoliberal cant. It's a response to neoliberal shifts in how education is financed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's not, it's not just private institutions, but the fact that if you look at a robust system like the University of Massachusetts, less than 10% of funding in the University of Massachusetts for higher education comes from taxpayer money. In most states, it's less than that. So public education is now being financed at the level of the individual family and the individual student as well.
Right. And tuitions there too have skyrocketed.
Yes. I mean, one of my nephews was applying this year, and his two choices were Hampshire and the University of Iowa. I was a huge fan of the University of Iowa, which I think is a great, great school. But when it came down to it, as somebody out of state, it was the same price.
Right. No, I remember talking to the editor, or then editor of AQ, and she was in shock that her kid was considering the University of Colorado for $55,000.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I think if we look at this from a more faculty-oriented perspective, I think one of the things that I think about is that publishing and the kinds of publishing that faculty in the humanities are supposed to do for tenure has not been rethought in my entire career. I mean, right now, those of us who are involved with digital humanities are trying to do that, but it's very difficult because there's a lot of pushback, and it's not something that actually, it's not a culture wars thing. It's not the conservatives believe this and the liberals believe that. The vast majority of academics are comfortable with a publishing structure that has not changed since World War II and has barely changed since the 1890s. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem on a number of levels, in that we, as college faculty, communicate almost not at all with those taxpayers out there and with voters and with a kind of larger public who we need to engage on a different level than the credentialing of their children.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it was once the case that there wasn't such a divide, or do we just romantically kind of look back to some golden age that never really existed? Do you know what I mean?
Well,
I mean, clearly, like, we know that Mario Savio stood on the steps of a free university.
Right.
Like, we know that.
Right.
There are certain kind of bedrock facts that we can track over that period that you're discussing.
Right.
But at the same time, like, was that Berkeley faculty, kind of engaged with the public in a way that we are not?
Well, I guess my romance sort of goes more to people like, say, Lionel Trilling or Richard Hofstadter, or, I was doing some research that never came to anything about Richard Hofstadter at one point, and one of his friends was talking about how ambitious he was. And, Hofstadter was a communist for a while and hid that pretty effectively for decades, right?
Really effectively.
Really effectively, right. And so, anyway, one of his friends said, when they were just beginning as lecturers at Columbia together, and every week when all of the big journals would come out, the New Republic and, all of the places that college professors used to publish all the time, if Hofstadter didn't have anything in it, he would go home and pull down the shades and lie on the couch and cry. And his friends would have to come over and encourage him and tell him that everything was going to be okay. Which is a great story and sort of underlines the fact that Hofstadter, as a scholar, had a kind of commitment to speaking to a very, very broad audience, to influencing politics. So that when he comes out with his article on paranoia in American politics during the Goldwater campaign, that's his moment. I mean, he sees this thing happening and says, what we need is history. The only thing that's going to explain this in history. Well, some people thought he was right and some people thought he was wrong, but the point is, he took the conversation about Goldwater to a whole different level.
Right.
Right. And I think that's the kind of thing that is not we don't talk enough about how to do that and why to do that and why it matters.
Right. So, but just to underscore this, so you're saying that things like public humanities, digital humanities, these various kind of rubrics that have popped up within universities that are, all in some way or another about getting intellectual work out into the world in different ways, that these are not just the things that will save faculty from oblivion, but these are things that could actually save the university from its disconnect with taxpayers, as you put it.
Absolutely. I think people need to understand what we do. Most people who are not academics, intelligent people, professional people, don't understand what we do. They will say with no animus whatsoever, boy, what a nice life. You guys don't have to work much, They don't understand the rhythm of our work. They don't understand why and how we commit to what we do. They don't understand how we think about teaching. I mean, it's sort of the whole language now about measuring teaching and evaluating teaching and this horrible thing assessment, the whole thing that Obama wants to do about how incomes are measured for our graduates, and that will be a sign of what effective teachers we are. I think the only reason that is so powerful is in the absence of us having much to say about what we do and why we do it.
And what's your interpretation of that?
I think very often people become academics because they're perfectly comfortable in small groups or alone. Those of us who are successful writers have to be comfortable being alone. Those of us who love to read, it's a singular activity. So I think there are many of us for whom it's not that we wouldn't like our work to be out there, but it doesn't really matter to us. I think universities have a tendency to be very self-enclosed, some more than others. Wesleyan was very self-enclosed. So whoever you were at Wesleyan was who you were. You could be the King of Poland outside of Wesleyan and nobody really cared. But, what you did yesterday at Wesleyan was what mattered. I think that's very typical of elite liberal arts colleges, and it's part of why they're such wonderful places for people to go to school. It's not so good for conveying the message about what you do outside the college, right? So that a place like Wesleyan or Swarthmore or Pomona or something tends to be characterized by passionate alumni who kind of carry the message of their college out there. But, hold a second. Okay, so those places tend to be characterized by, cadres of alumni who, sort of go out in the world and carry the message of the college and recruit other people to come back in. But the colleges themselves tend not to have any real-time engagement with the world. And when they do, it's often something bad, like the rape settlement at Wesleyan, or the thing that's been going on at Swarthmore with Hillel, where they're in such trouble with the National. And so, Swarthmore kids actually have a ton of engagement with their communities. We never hear about that. Swarthmore doesn't really get that message out. And then something happens with Hillel, and we all know about it, and that's what the rest of the country now knows about Swarthmore. So I think faculty have to be part of a real rethinking. It's not just the community engagement that you are doing, but creating creating more noise about it. And some of that involves, I think, making colleges and universities more porous. We tend not to invite other people in.
Right. Right. Which is the flip side of the coin of public humanities, at least in certain places. It's not just about getting intellectuals outside the Ivy walls, but actually getting all kinds of other people inside and kind of creating new spaces for conversation, if that's possible. It's interesting. So, what other words for faculty do you have about the kind of work that we could be doing to rebuild this kind of a bridge? I mean, it seems to me that one of the obstacles is this kind of culture war atmosphere that we've been living in for 20 some years, which we'll talk about in more detail. But are there other kind of policy pronouncements, from inside the institution that you would make for your colleagues?
Well, honestly, one of the things I was thinking about the other day, my partner works in public education. She's a PhD anthropologist, but she does a lot of work with schools and school coalitions and so on. And we were at a big event the other day where somebody was being honored for the work that she's done in fighting the high-stakes testing. And there were two really interesting things about it. One is there is this group that is organized of principals and teachers that work very effectively to try to end high-stakes testing. And a member of that group got up and gave a little speech about the current state of things. And I didn't understand half of what she was talking about, which really worried me a great deal. So I went up and talked to her afterwards and said, we have to talk about social media because it's actually really bad that somebody like me, who cares deeply about this issue, who lives with Nancy Barnes, did not understand what you were talking about. And it's my fault. I will own that. So I think, often someone like me, that was a moment in which I walked away and said, I should be seeking out more of this information. But the other thing I learned is one of the things this coalition does is it gets people to run for community school boards who are against high-stakes testing. And then they organize the school board to resist the test and so on. I think university faculty need to pay attention to the schools, not just that their children go to, but that everybody's children go to. And I think universities and colleges need to take some responsibility for what is going on at the secondary school level. Because what happens to the humanities there is ultimately going to happen to us. I think we've seen that as the pattern in, standardization, assessment, and so on. It's all emanating up. And it's not just that it gets to us eventually, but there are people who genuinely need our help. Public school teachers and principals simply don't have the political and social status that they once did. And so to the extent that making common cause with them could actually help everybody, and obviously if you talk about practically how does that happen, well, we should be running for school board. We should be asking, for example, do you know anybody that worked on the Common Core?
No.
I don't either. And yet, this is the biggest thing that's happening right now. And I don't know a single university professor who worked on that. Or who is actually working to sort out, because actually on some levels the Common Core seems pretty good, right? There are some things that are very substantial about it. But to really think about how do you make a case for this? What kind of a calendar would work to make it successful? How is it going to work differently? You and I know a lot of things about region, for example, and things we don't know we can pull in someone else, Nyan Shah or somebody else, to come and talk about. But, how would the Common Core work differently in New York, Atlanta, Seattle, Tulsa, and we have these huge networks of university faculty who could really work on that, but we don't. Now, there are good reasons why we don't. It's not like we're lazy.
There was an iteration of this back in the 90s. Wasn't Gary Nash at the head of a national standards?
Yeah.
And what happened to that effort?
I think the Common Core is the sequel to national standards. And who was pushing national standards? Was that the Clinton administration?
It must have been the Clinton years.
I think so. But, for example, at the AHA, we don't even talk about should there be a national standard. Mm-hmm. What do we think about that as the AHA? it's not that we don't have plenty to talk about at the AHA and plenty of urgent political issues, but that strikes me as something that we need to begin to think about. Well, what do we think, and how do we reach out to the people who are on the ground working with us? You know,
that's really interesting. So let's. I want to come back to the kind of the culture wars dimensions of these years, particularly because of the writing you've done as the tenured radical. I mean, that the choice of that moniker itself kind of announces to the world that you kind of see yourself as having been born in the crucible of the, of the culture wars. And I'm just about your strict contemporary, so I know exactly like the arc of the years that you're talking about. But can you talk about, I mean, kind of your kind of coming to consciousness in that world of culture war, kind of inside the institution, but also how these 20 or 25 years look to you, and some of the work that you've tried to do through your writing under that name.
Right. Well, I mean, I would start by saying I was remarkably naive until quite late about what was bubbling up as the culture wars. I paid almost no attention to the feminist sex wars as they were happening in the 1980s, and they were happening like at NYU, right? And I was doing something else. And my first inkling of what was going on was when I was at Penn, and the first Gulf War happened, and it happened very, very quickly. And Penn was one of those schools that had ROTC, and that kids would afford to go to Penn by being in ROTC. So when the Gulf War started, our students were called up. And I'd never been in that situation before, where students just disappeared from the classroom because they were being called up to their units. And it was very unsettling, not just for me, but for the other students. And so a group of us kind of met in the hall where the Penn History Department was, and we were talking about, you know, what were we going to say to the students when we went to class that day. And Alan Kors, big conservative, stops by, and he's listening to this conversation, and he says, "I am outraged that any of you would think it was appropriate to talk about the Gulf War in your classes." And I was just stunned. And of course, I was a visitor. The others were untenured people, and they were like, "Oh, I have to go to my office now." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "There should be an absolute barrier between what happens in your classroom and what happens in the world. And your students should not have to have your views of the political situation inflicted on them." I said, "Okay, thanks a lot." And I went to my office, and I thought, this is really strange. Because I had been educated in an atmosphere in which politics was always in the classroom. Always. I mean, Vietnam, feminism, whatever. And I did not truly understand that incident until several years later, when, the big books, the Alan Bloom, Closing of the American Mind, when those things started coming out, I began to realize that there was a community of people having these conversations, and I didn't know them. And that's the thing, in retrospect, that I think is most interesting about the culture wars. It was sort of pre-internet, before we all divided into Facebook networks, and you read this blog, I read that blog, and so on and so forth. There were whole groups of people who really only spoke to each other. And at the time, I kind of thought, well, all academics are like me. How could you be an academic and not be a liberal? So as these people started identifying, I still didn't actually take it that seriously. And then, of course, I ended up at Wesleyan, which was possibly, one of the most liberal/radical places you could be. And I was involved with Dick Oman, who, had begun the Radical Caucus at the MLA and so on. I became very involved with cultural studies in those early years at Wesleyan, which at that time was a very radical project. And I think, on a certain level, what I regret about those years is that I didn't take conservative academics seriously enough. And that I kind of bought into the cultural divide thing. that being said, and I guess the reason I regret it is I think I was not engaged early enough with real-time history, that education was actually changing right in front of me. All of these things were happening, and I was on a kind of time delay with all of it because I was at Wesleyan and we were Wesleyan, That being said, I think the culture wars were sort of happening alongside of what we now realize were some other changes that actually, I hate to use the word progress because it just sounds too simplistic, but like at that same moment in which gays and lesbians and women and people of color were being attacked, we were also embedding ourselves in the academy in greater and greater numbers, creating fields, creating programs that then became departments, that then began granting PhDs. I mean, the whole trajectory of, say, the NYU American Studies program, which went from sort of like nothing to really something, that happened over that period. So the culture wars were both driving the creation of this huge conservative academic establishment and funding it. At the same time, I actually think what liberals were doing in response to it in radicals was some serious institution building. And they knew how to do it because they were New Left, they were feminists, they came out of the ACT UP struggles, and so on and so forth. So a lot of grassroots organizing fed back into the university to embed these programs as a resistant act. Now the question is, have all of those programs actually become just as mainstream and conservative? It's like, it's astonishing to me that we created all of these new PhD programs, truly radical knowledge, and people are still writing dissertations on paper with 1-inch margins and 6 articles and 2 books for tenure, or so I don't even know where I'm going with this, but that at the same time that this radical impulse was being built into the academy, it was also accommodating itself to the academy in a huge way.
That's really interesting. Another piece of this, I wonder what you think of this, because it seems to me that in those same years, one of the other things that was happening, while there was institution building of this sort that you just described happening within educational institutions, there was this other brand of institution building on the outside of them, places like Olin and Scaife and Heritage, which became like kind of the bastions of conservative thought.
Absolutely.
Kind of outside the university system, but kind of lobbing shells into the university system.
Well, outside the university system, but of course what they were doing is they were kind of... it was like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where Dr. Frankenfurter is building a man upstairs. Well, they would build intellectuals, so someone like Dinesh D'Souza, where does D'Souza come from? He comes from a conservative publication at Dartmouth that is funded basically as a farm team for one of these foundations. And these foundations would then fund these guys and women, so you didn't have to be smart. What you had to be was ambitious, but you didn't have to be smart. And in order to go on and be an academic in the traditional way that you and I understood it, you had to be ambitious, you had to work hard, but you also had to be smart. You couldn't know nothing. And, for all that it's not fair that everybody doesn't get a job, you and I have been on all kinds of search committees in which you see that there's some people in the pile who maybe they just really haven't got it. Maybe they don't know enough. Maybe they don't have the vision to be able to really shine in this. And, I think for that conservative intellectual establishment, they had the money. They'd give them an office. They had their own presses. It's Dr. Frankenfurter.
Right. So it was over 20 years ago that Pat Buchanan gave that speech that I always think of as kind of the opening salvo of the culture wars. I'm sure it wasn't, but that's how I remember it these many years later. you are still calling yourself the tenured radical, which is interesting to me, because at this point, you and I probably both have students who would not know what the referent
Right.
is.
Right.
So, can you talk a little bit about how you see that operating now? What is
Right.
the kind of, where are we in the culture wars story,
Yeah.
and how do you position yourself within
Yeah.
that? And of what utility is that moniker to you
Right.
in the writing that you do?
Right. Well, I originally chose it, and my partner, Carrie Nelson wrote that book, Manifesto of a Tenured Radical, before I established my blog. And Nancy keeps saying to me, you're ever going to call that man and apologize for stealing his name? I'm like, oh, come on, get a grip. It's just a joke. And I picked it, in fact, as a joke. Because the idea of somebody being tenured and truly radical seems so absurd to me. And I think for anybody who's actually gone through a tenure process, anyone who's gone through a tenure process knows what I'm talking about. That the act of disciplining people and your correct response to that discipline is what gets you tenure. And some of us are wonderful and some of us aren't, and some of us are nice, some of us aren't, some of us publish more and some of us publish less, but it's how you're able to hit the mark and how you're able to make yourself legible to people who hold your career in their hands that get you through the tenure process. And so tenured radical always seemed to me like an oxymoron. So that's why I chose it. You're right that a lot of young people have absolutely no idea where I'm coming from now, because I'll find comments on my blog and people will write, you call yourself a radical, foo, well, yes, foo, probably, I would say that as the blog has morphed, I sort of began with a okay, I'm inside the machine kind of attitude, and I will tell you how the machine works. And that was at a moment in blogging in which...
When was this, by the way?
This was 2006.
Okay.
And so I kind of locked onto blogging right when it began to go. There were a couple of academic bloggers before me, like Invisible Adjunct, she was a biggie, Bitch PhD, a couple of those who had started before, but I was sort of in that first wave of people. And when you chose your blog title, you chose a persona. So like there was a blogger who called herself New Kid on the Hallway. And she chose that persona because she had 3 different jobs, which had not worked out. And so she was always the new kid at school. And actually her blog, the decoration was lockers in a hall. So for me, tenured radical, it was about being kind of angry. It was about being able to respond to conservatives, but it was also about being able to say, let's critique the machine. Let's critique what's going on here. And I started it, I think, about 5 years after I got tenure. I was in the middle of a sort of very prolonged promotion to full professor, which was discouraging and incoherent. So there's some pieces that I wrote in that first year, which I could say now I truly regret. I think they were not thoughtful. But I think what I also learned is that there was a huge group of people out there who wanted to talk about why we did what we did, what it meant, how it could be fixed, what was wrong, what was right, what were the pleasures of it, what were the dangers of it. And so that's how Tenured Radical sort of morphed into this thing it was almost like a salon. I would occasionally do advice columns. Like one of my most popular columns ever is about what butch lesbians should wear to a job interview. That has gone all over the place. But then there are other things like, what you should be thinking about before you do your interview at the AHA. There are history departments all over the country that have that posted to their website. Was that a radical thing to do? Well, no, not really, because, the way we hire people for jobs is just bizarre in many ways. I mean, it makes sense to us, but I don't think it makes sense to anyone else. On the other hand, was it a radical thing for graduate students to actually get a set of instructions to this process? Yes, absolutely.
Right, demystification. Yes.
Demystification, and also just like, tell me what I'm supposed to do, and I'll do it. You know? So to the extent that I kind of took on the whole business of, you know, graduate students and younger faculty don't understand how this machine works, and I will tell them, that was, in a sense, a kind of radical project at the time, I think.
Mm-hmm. How has the project changed in the 8 years you've been doing it?
Well, an early and big change was when I began the blog, I was pseudonymous, and then I dropped my pseudonymity and put my name on it. And that occurred about 6 or 7 months into the blog. And I am actually one of those people that does not think people should blog anonymously. I really don't. I mean, people can do what they do, and I won't think less of them. But I think it's a bad idea. I think it's easier to be accountable and responsible in your writing if your name's on it.
How did you come to that in your own work?
I did something really terrible, actually, which is I wrote about something that had happened in class. And I would actually now say no one should ever do that. It's probably a FERPA violation. I mean, there's so many things wrong with that, I can't even begin to say. But what was wrong with this was that it was actually a teaching problem that I was trying to work out. But one of the students who had been part of that conversation was humiliated by it. And at the time, I did not know that the students knew that I was writing this blog. In fact, they were all reading it, which is the other reason not to be anonymous, because nobody tells you that they know who you are. And so some student came up to her in the library and said, "Oh my God, it's so great. Professor Potter wrote about you in her blog." And the student went and read it and was really shamed by it. And fortunately came to me and said, "You did this, and it was horrible." And I felt terrible, and I instantly understood why it was wrong and apologized profusely and took the post down. And then I went and talked to a friend of mine who was in the philosophy department, a woman named Laurie Gruen, who's an ethicist. And I said, I need to talk to you about this blog and how to both set boundaries, decide what's good and what's not good, and then also create a statement about what the ethic of the blog is. And she worked with me on that. And I actually think it's one of the many wonderful things of working in a university is there's always an expert somewhere who will help you.
If only our administrators thought so.
I know. Exactly. And Lori really, really helped me. So I changed all of that up. I think the other thing, and this didn't exactly go away when I put my name on the blog, but it helped people talk to me about it in a whole different way, is when you're a blogger, you have to reassure people constantly that you're not going to write about them. Now, some people can't do that because they do write about other people all the time. I think it's a really bad idea. I think particularly since I've become a person who works on the recent past, and I've thought very, very deeply about what does it mean to do scholarship on people who are alive, that is in part an outcome of the blog, and thinking about, what does it mean to put real life people in your blog? What does it mean to review someone's book on your blog if you don't have an editor to say, God, Claire, don't go there? Or if I do have a blog, for example, I don't review books I don't like anymore. I just don't. And I went through a period where every once in a while I would review something like, what's his name, Sudhir Venkatesh, who, The Economist up at Columbia. I really, really hated his book on Chicago gangs in the project, and I actually thought it was a piece of unethical research and very self-promoting, and that he shouldn't have done it. And I wrote a whole blog post about that, and I'm still not sorry about that. That being said, again, if you and I are reviewing for The Nation or the Journal of American History, there are a lot of books that are never going to get to us. The book editors are going to say, nope, this isn't for us, we're not reviewing it, and they take that decision out of our hands. So if you are a blogger, a single person, you have to make all these decisions yourself. And for me, it has made most sense over time to veer toward kindness whenever I can. And to, and I fail at that from time to time. But at least I know I'm failing. At least I have a standard that I've set for myself in which failure becomes obvious at a certain point. So I think using the blog for good is really important. Today I put up a post that I think may cause some trouble. I don't know, but it's from a group of graduate students who are trying to get NYU to drop something from its application in which people who have been convicted of felonies are asked to check a box, right? And they wrote something fantastic about why this is racist and why NYU is actually perpetuating structural racism and how little NYU understands that. That's not going to make a lot of people at NYU very happy. I considered at a certain point getting in touch with the people at NYU and saying, would you like to respond to this? I'm not a journalist, but in fact it's the responsible thing to do. And in the end I didn't. I decided, this is a piece that's gone through a collective process. They have a right to have it published without anybody stepping on them, and then we'll just see what happens next. But more and more, I think I've thought of the blog as a publication in a more conventional sense, rather than a site of resistance.
Right. And so how have you come to define your role? Like, is this, it seems, just from the outside, like it consumes a lot of energy, just like teaching does, and just like your other writing and research.
Yes.
So how do you think of that niche in your creative and work life, and kind of what's the purpose, what's the objective, what's the aim?
Well, I would say two things. One is I get to write about a lot of things that otherwise I wouldn't get to write about. If I see something and I want to write about that and I have something to say, I can put it out there. That in turn has led to opportunities to write for other people. And I now get asked to do things that I haven't been asked to do before, and people saying, well, how about this? And I published a piece in Jacobin after the Windsor decision, about that queer studies and queer theory had so much invested in the anti-marriage stance, and that floor had been pulled out from under them. So what was going to happen next, right? Well, that was nobody would want to put that in social text. There are dozens of people who are better qualified to write that piece than I, but it was my idea, and Jacobin wanted it, and I did a good job for them. I never would have been asked, and I never would have had the self-confidence to do it if I hadn't been a blogger. So I actually think one of the features of blogging is a lot of writing practice. My friend Ann Little said at the AHA, to somebody who said, why would you do this? It's so much work. And she said, the more you write, the more you write. And and it's true. I'm better at writing. I'm faster at writing. I think I have a better voice than I've ever had. And people notice you, and people get in touch with you and say, would you like to do X, Y, or Z? So it's really sort of expanded the number and variety of venues that I publish in. It means I get on the radio. It means I get on TV. And I think, a lot of people would say, well, you've got tenure and you're a full professor, so of course you can waste your time like this. I don't think it's a waste of time. And I think part of what I've learned from it is I think we need to find some way to help associate professors and assistant professors learn how to do these things at earlier stages of their career when they have energy, when, their lives aren't so complicated, but also when they're really, your mind is very fertile in those you're learning a lot very fast in the first 7 to 10 years of your career. It seems such a shame to me to take people and say, okay, you just have to wait.
Just keep writing books.
Just keep writing books and articles and, having them refereed endlessly for 2 or 3 years and so on and so forth, and just wait.
Right, and write for that audience of 6.
Yes, exactly. And, of course, the thing is, a lot of people would love to be on the radio, but you have to learn how to do it. I actually was very, very lucky because my first book got a lot of attention from documentary filmmakers, and it was at that same moment when cable was really exploding, so they needed lots of content. So I was always being interviewed about J. Edgar Hoover. And I learned how to do it. I learned...
The gift that keeps on giving.
The gift that... I know. I mean, people still call me and say, oh, I love this argument about J. Edgar Hoover. But you learn to talk to a camera. You have to learn to be on television. You have to learn, just even little things like when an interviewer asks you a question, you have to reframe the question and then answer it. So that if you're the interviewer and you say, tell me about J. Edgar Hoover's relationship with his mother, I can't just say, oh, well, that's an interesting story. See, I have to say, J. Edgar Hoover's relationship with his mother was,
right.
It's like you have to learn how to create a topic sentence for yourself. And so a lot of people don't learn that, and then what happens, I think, is they don't have the self-confidence that they could ever do it.
Mm-hmm. So this is interesting because I, at some level, agree with everything you're saying about how we get graduate students and younger faculty unnecessarily to trim their sails and not, really not fulfill all that they're capable of in those years for institutional reasons alone. On the other hand, old man that I am now, I sometimes look at some of our younger colleagues and see a kind of expediency that I don't necessarily admire.
Right.
How do you think about that kind of trade-off?
Well, I think it's very hard to know why they are the way they are without taking into the account that the funnel has narrowed so completely. I mean, the fact that, and this is probably different at Yale than at Wesleyan, but at Wesleyan, we used to go through job applications and basically we were looking at the dissertation, and that was all. And by the time I left, any graduate student who wanted to have a prayer of making it into that top 12, getting a conference interview, had to have a couple articles out, maybe a book contract, maybe,
right,
so they have ramped up their production, their ambition, and so on, because it takes so much more nowadays. I mean, that Furstenberg book that I was reading, he says at the beginning, and it's a very weird thought, and I don't even know what to think about it, but he says, it is likely that you will teach, your first job will be at a less good institution to the one you went to. This makes it imperative that you get into the best possible institution. And I thought, okay, so that I thought, well, but how would you know? And how would you know how far you will fall? And so on. So I think to the extent that, and I do see this among the people on the blogs, particularly the people who are very militant around the contingent faculty situation, their belief that they are so good and that the better they are, the worse the cheat is when they don't get the job that they think they should have. Or any job, but there are a lot of them who just don't think they're in the job they should have. I mean, there are a lot of people in tenure-track jobs who are just ripshit all the time about how they're treated. And on the one hand, many of them are treated quite badly, and then on the other hand, they're on edge about things like, not getting a reimbursement for a research trip for a month, or, okay, so all right, you have to carry that on your credit card. I'm sorry, but it's not like one of the worst problems in higher education. So I think, nowadays it's very difficult, given how hard people are working and how much they think they have to do to survive the process. It's very difficult for them to really take any kind of frustration, any kind of barrier, any kind of disappointment, any kind of failure with any grace. And I do think that's too bad. And I think probably their friendships are just as strong. I don't really see them being as collaborative, being as caring about each other in some concrete ways as I think our generation of graduate students was. There was something called the Women's Studies Methodology group in New York when we were at NYU. A couple of NYU students started it. And I look back on that, and the people who were in that group, people would come from all over. Regina Kunzel was in it, Lisa Dugan was in it, Anna Smith was in it, George Chauncey was in it. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. And nobody was there to build their careers. We were there to read each other's work and write more. I mean, I don't want to say, it's like, a Paradise Lost or something like that, but I think it's very difficult to know, like, how much of this have we created, you and me, by trying to keep the system going in the best ways we know how, and how much of it is the inability of graduate students and younger faculty to actually want to change the world. Like, they want to succeed in the world as it is, I think, and I don't think a lot of them want to change it, except to maybe make more room for themselves. And I understand why they want to make room for themselves, but I don't think that those of us, we who are tenured radicals, are getting much support from much younger people in changing things. I think they're very afraid to change things. This is a system they know.
Right. And it's a system that's punitive.
It's a system that's punitive. And sometimes I think, of course, the people, when they go into it, they're making a choice. They're going into it because this is what they want. And I sometimes think one of the things we need to think a little harder about, at least those of us who are running graduate programs, is where we get our graduate students. Should we really start saying, no, we don't take you right out of college?
Just as a matter
of course. Yeah. I mean, like, if you want to be in the Harvard Business School, which is not something I would recommend, it actually sounds like a horrific place, but actually you can't even apply to Harvard Business School unless you've been working for 2 or 3 years. You have to have actually done something and have a reason to be there. And I do wonder if the humanities ought to think about that. Ought we to be admitting people whose idea of a life is pure scholarship, disengaged from the rest of the society outside the university? I don't think so. I mean, it would be a very big project. But, HISCON, the University of Santa Cruz program, for many years, they have always said to their students, even though their students actually do very well on the job market, but they've always said to them, we're not interested in an academic career. We're interested in training you to go out and be activists. And many of the people who work there are activists. I don't think everybody has to be an activist, but I do think if humanities programs thought a little more deeply about the other things that they wanted their students to do and really changed their programs to make that happen and changed the people they admitted who make that happen, that could be a really important reform.
Let me just ask 2 more questions.
Yeah.
One, this goes way back to the beginning. You described that first school that you went to. I guess it was K through 12 school. You described it as a kind of feminist or proto-feminist kind of nest.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about just the position of feminism as a project inside educational institutions during these years that we've been discussing. Because on the one hand, maybe from the outside it looks like feminism won, right?
Right.
You know, but on the other hand, it's kind of shocking how little the gains have been.
Yep.
But I just wonder about your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was really a Title IX kid, right? And so when I was in high school, I didn't actually know that much about feminism, except that my grandfather took Ms. Magazine. My grandmother died, and my grandfather sort of developed this project, like he didn't want to, be old and dumb and so on. So he started taking magazines, and one of the magazines he started taking was Ms. So I would read Ms. Magazine, and I learned all this stuff about, Gloria Steinem and the Clique, and so I knew all of this, but women's schools were interesting institutions because on the one hand, it was all about getting you into the best possible college. And on the other hand, that usually meant a Seven Sisters school, up until, I was in high school. It was all about the Seven Sisters. And then the other thing is they were terrified of lesbianism. So the whole thing was about, you will be an incredibly high-achieving woman, and you will also have this wonderful family. And I didn't even know I was a lesbian in high school, but I knew there was something terribly wrong with this. I was being prepared for excellence. I was supposed to get straight A's. I was supposed to go to a great school. And then I was supposed to marry and have children. And I just didn't get it right. And so I remember going in for college counseling. And the college counselor, who was a graduate of Smith, they were all graduates of Smith and Bryn Mawr and Mount Holyoke. And most of them were single women and lesbians, which I didn't understand until much later. And she kind of looks at it, and my father's sitting there, and my mother's sitting there, and she says, well, Claire's a wonderful student and has great scores, and we're thinking about Vassar and Bryn Mawr and Radcliffe. And my father, who had never said a word about my education up until that moment, but who knew that all the Ivies had just gone co-ed, stood up and said, well, we're thinking Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. We're done. And we laughed. And in a weird way, that was like the first feminist moment, right? When my father said, this is not good enough. This does not make sense. Why would she do that when she could do that? And it's also a kind of sad moment because you sort of look at it and say, all of these schools that had sustained women's education were suddenly second rate, right? So it was a very odd message. So I go on to Yale, where, of course, feminism is going great guns because Catherine McKinnon is there, and the women's studies program is starting, and there's this big intro to women's studies that they have fought for years, where they have TAs that are drawn from the community and so on. And a big place that it was happening, of course, was in athletics, which I was a field hockey player, and so you would be in the locker room, and somebody would hand you a copy of, Andrea Dworkin's Woman Hating and say, you have to read this. And I'd be like, okay, so there's a lot happening about, there was a lot of ferment, and none of it was actually connected to a real movement for me until I got out of college and moved to New York. And I realized, there is this thing called a feminist movement, and you can actually be part of it and do things and so on. So I would say, yes, feminism won, liberal feminism won, right? Liberal feminism fought for the right of women to go and kick ass with men, and the best one wins. And that was no small achievement. Radical feminism, in some ways, I'm writing a book about radical feminism now, and some days I think radical feminism didn't deserve to win on a certain level. I mean, there was so much going on that was so destructive and organized around personalities and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there are some pieces of radical feminism that really deserved a better shot than they got. I look, for example, and I'm thinking about cultural feminism, the kind of radical feminism that everybody hates, Andrea Dworkin feminism and so on. You go into the subways now, and all the pornography's covered up, or at least the boobs and everything like that are covered up. And then there's a movie poster on the wall that, from the latest horror movie that shows a woman horribly mutilated. It's right out there, And you think, well, actually, there are some pieces of this we need to go back to that nobody takes seriously anymore. Or the ways in which video gaming is so misogynist. Now, you don't actually have to believe that little boys want to rape because they saw someone being raped in a video. You don't have to believe that to say there's something terribly, terribly wrong for playtime to be taken up with misogynistic violence, And so, I think we could very usefully return to some of that stuff. I think it would be very hard. I think in this sort of post-feminist, queer studies now has sort of really veered away from identity altogether and said, all right, we can take all this knowledge and do really important things with it that have nothing to do with sex and have nothing to do with bodies, real bodies at least. And all of that's fine, but I think it's left behind a kind of residue that we're not dealing with, and we should. I don't know whether you read Jack Halberstam's recent piece about trigger warnings. Well, the whole trigger warnings thing that's going on right now is very interesting. And Jack wrote a piece in which he said, okay, it was anti-trigger warning, and it was anti, all the stuff that's going on around the use of the word tranny. And a lot of trans people really hate it, and they think it's an epithet, and they don't want it used. And then there are other people like Jack and Justin Vivian Bond saying, this is an important word, and Well, there's now a kind of divide between some genuinely radical thinkers who have done very important work and very young people who are not satisfied with these explanations, who are not satisfied with saying, feminism is over, feminism has won, and I think it'd be worth attending to that. I think it'd be worth, it's interesting because, you and I, and there's a whole bunch of us, we talked about this before, we're kind of in charge now, and we're sort of heading into the last 15 years of our university career where we're wrapping up our involvement with institutions and taking ourselves wherever we'll take ourselves. It's easy to be too involved in that project, I think, from my perspective, or so much too involved in that project that you're not really listening to young people anymore. And I think a lot of our students are trying to get our attention about some stuff that we could actually bring feminism back to. We could bring queer theory back to in some very, very useful ways and engage in a more robust way at the grassroots.
One of the most radical things I've ever heard a university administrator say is the dean of faculty, a really wonderful administrator at Brown, said the most important thing we can be doing, the most crucial thing we can be doing is really listening to the younger people around us.
Right.
I think there's some real wisdom in that.
I think that's true, and I think sometimes when they have to try too hard to get our attention, that's when they start doing things that really make us angry. Like, I think some of this stuff about the trigger warnings, I understand why faculty, I wouldn't want to go through my syllabus and try to decide what was going to cause people to be re-traumatized and give them anxiety attacks and so on. And I actually did have a confrontation with students about the movie Black Robe. My last semester at Wesleyan, I have taught Black Robe for 15 years. I'd never had a problem with it. And this last time I taught it, some students came up to me and said, you should have given us a trigger warning. We have rape survivors in this class. And I was shocked. I was completely shocked, but only, I think, because it had never happened before. And when I thought about it, and even when I think about it now, I think, well, it is a terribly violent movie. And that's why we taught it, because colonialism was violent. It wasn't nice. It wasn't just a theory of encounter. It was terrible. And then that becomes a new teaching problem that's hard to solve. All right, how do we convey that? How do we get students to really deal with that? And if we give trigger warnings, does that mean we're saying you don't have to cope with the bad things that history
you can
is?
opt out of any conversation.
Yeah, it can be as nice as you want it to be, I think that's a teaching problem. And I think, when we push students away and say, you're bad, you're wrong, you're too sheltered, we're not going to deal with this, then we miss the interesting conversation, which is, okay, we have a new teaching problem.
Yeah.
Just like they had new teaching problems in the 60s when there was a war raging in Southeast Asia, and faculty felt like, I can't just go in and teach the American Revolution in the same way. I think that's true now.
Last question.
Yeah.
You seem like someone who loves what you do. You also seem like someone who's highly critical of the institutions that you've inhabited, or that you inhabit now. In summary, what is your view of the state of higher education right now, and how optimistic or pessimistic are you about what's coming down the pike?
Well, I think, it's one of the most successful enterprises that everybody says is failing. I think that's the paradox of higher education. Nobody's stopping going to college. I mean, yes, the numbers are falling, but only because the population is falling. And actually, the more immigrants that come to the United States, the more actually education is going to stabilize, because that's one of the big reasons that people come to this country, is to be able to send their children to American colleges and universities. I'm highly critical of it, I think, in part because that's what we do, right? As scholars, we research, we critique, we poke to try and ask the most interesting questions and so on. And I think it's really important when we critique higher education that we don't do it without some kind of goal in mind. And it's interesting because I have a book series, and I got a manuscript a few months ago that was just a disaster. And the first thing that happened is I got really pissed. Like, why am I having to deal with this? And then, of course, I realized, this person has worked really hard to produce this terrible thing. And I have to find some way of dealing with it. And I thought, okay, do not tell her anything. Don't make any criticism if you don't have a solution to the problem, right? And I really thought about it like that. And I kind of think that way about higher education too. What I can't bear nowadays, and I do think this is an outcome of cultural studies as it evolved on the left, is we have critique without any commitment to change. I mean, concrete change, not theoretical change, not change that could happen if there was all the money in the world, but real change in the places where we live. And I think often our colleagues see that as a capitulation. If we really, for example, deal with it, that 60% of the people who are teaching English literature in this country are going to be contingent faculty. Woo!
What was that?
I think it's that they're moving furniture around. If we really accept that, that will be a huge defeat, and we're handing the university over to the administrators. I think we actually, as faculty, need to devise new strategies, both for partnering with administrators in ways we're reluctant to do so, but that become increasingly necessary. There are more and more of them. And they are more and more powerful. That's right. And if we don't partner with them, then eventually they get to do what they want to do uninformed by our project. And I do think we have to do that. So I do think we ought not to be critiquing without actually putting forward programs for change that we're willing to invest in. That's really what I believe. I don't think higher education is going to fall apart. I think the greatest threat to higher education has failed, which is the for-profit university. I think they are failing miserably. Nobody's making money from them. Nobody's getting educations from them. And I think they'll be gone. I mean, I think the MOOC thing was really interesting because that came and went very quickly. I don't think it's really coming back in the ways that people anticipated that it was going to come back.
It's coming back in unanticipated ways, and it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Now they're talking about flipped classes, and there's all this stuff
Yeah.
around kind of using the technology but discarding the MOOC model.
Well, and there are lots of interesting ways to do it, and that's one of the things I love about digital humanities is really kind of getting in there with people and mixing it up and saying, okay, let's try this thing that everybody thinks is so horrible, and we'll see if it works, and we'll play with it. But part of the reason MOOCs failed is that faculty at major universities who thought they were going to make a lot of money off of this rose up and said no. The faculty at Harvard, the faculty at MIT, the faculty at Princeton. And I think, for example, someone like Jeremy Aaron teaching a MOOC and writing about it in Perspectives was really, really powerful. Now, I think Jeremy thinks his experience was far more positive than I think it is. But on the other hand, he was really candid about what he did, why he did it, what failed, what succeeded, and I think that was an enormous gift to all of us, So I think when faculty engage, and then when faculty are willing to talk to each other more broadly about what they've learned from that engagement, that's important. I would say one other thing, which is unless we as faculty and teach our graduate students to discuss failure more openly, we're going to have a lot of trouble moving forward. Because, certainly in the digital humanities world, your failures are just as important as your successes. It's true in science too. We don't know enough about why we fail when we fail. And I think sort of rehabilitating failure as a project that can be creative, that we can enjoy processing, will actually help us, move forward in the higher education project.
I lied. Actually, that wasn't the last question.
Okay.
I have one more because going back to you were talking about the administrators are outnumbering us. One of the things that's struck me so much in my travels in the last 2 years or so is that when we talk to our colleagues across the country, it almost doesn't matter what kind of institution they work at. We're all seeing the same things.
Right.
Huge state institutions, small private institutions,
right.
liberal arts colleges.
Right.
There's just some of the same phenomena are
right.
sweeping across higher education. So I just wondered about your experience going from Wesleyan to the New School, two institutions that couldn't be more different in certain ways. How has that been, and what do you see on the ground here in terms of the kinds of big questions for higher education that we're talking about?
It's actually been an amazing experience, and I loved my students at Wesleyan. They were amazing people. Many of them are my colleagues now, which I just love, and they're really friends. To tell you the truth, teaching at Wesleyan is kind of like having Christmas every day. It's really great until you wake up and you go, oh, it's Christmas again, Because, most of those students, they will do well with anyone, And it's not like I need to be needed for me, but they don't need me to be coming up with wonderful creative strategies. They don't need me to be pushing the edge with digital this and digital that and so on. And in a way, Wesleyan wasn't an environment that welcomed that. Like Yale, if you leave with a Wesleyan degree, you can pretty much write your ticket. Other terrible things might happen. You might become an alcoholic. You might have a terrible disease, But if you have Wesleyan on your vita, people will open the door for you and give you a chance. And that's not true of students at the New School. And particularly my students, we're an adult education program. Many of my students have failed at education more than once. So part of what you're coping with as a teacher is people actually have extreme responses to failure that are not, oh my God, I can't get a B, I won't get into law school, that are like, I'm handing this paper in late, that's happening to me a million times before, I can see how it's going to unroll, I'm going to fail this class, and then I'm going to flunk out of school, I can't handle it, you know. So your teaching strategies actually have to change to try to help people not get into those repetitive cycles of failure and shame and so on. I think it's made me a much better teacher. You know, I think I was an excellent teacher when I was at Wesleyan, and I was an excellent teacher in a certain model that I had developed about as far as I could develop. I don't think I thought about it like that at the time, but I certainly think about that now, because I've actually learned to be a good teacher in a whole bunch of different ways here. There's certain kinds of things, for example, at Wesleyan, we were expected to spend time with our students. We were expected to be in office hours, make appointments with them, do group work with them, blah, blah, blah. Nobody expects you to do that here, which means most people don't. Which means if you have a group of students and say, hey, you know, that project you developed in my class is really great, it's really got legs, why don't we do an independent study in the fall and you guys can finish it? They come in, the three of them, for, 12 weeks, and they think it's the most marvelous experience they've ever had, because they've actually never done that. They've never sat with a teacher for 2 hours a week all by themselves and gotten all the attention. It's really cool. It's a really cool thing to be able to do, and there's actually one group of students, they've developed this whole project that we're turning into a high school curriculum. It will be a curriculum resource, so that people who want to work the AIDS crisis into their curriculum will have something to work with. These guys have been working it. They've done a wonderful job. I'm really not teaching them. I'm sort of directing traffic. Mm-hmm. They have the ideas. I figure out how to affect them. And then at a certain point, I said, the AHA is going to be in New York next year, and you guys should put in a proposal because it's going to be here. And I actually didn't think anything would come of it, but I thought the act of writing a conference proposal would help them distill what they were doing. And damned if they didn't get in, right? So it's the kind of thing where I never would have suggested that to Wesleyan students, because the AHA was my world, not their world. But you teach adults, and you think, well, why not? Why can't you do it? So they're going to do this. So I think it's new challenges, it's unexpected new rewards, and I think it's not in the Wesleyan model, very often the reward was like a great senior thesis where you've seen one person develop for 4 years, and then they've produced a piece of scholarship that's real scholarship, which means basically they're like me now. Right. But these students aren't like me. And actually, the liberating thing is I don't want them to be. I want them to be them. And I want to see what role I can play in helping them be them. Now, you could say that's another model for higher education. But right now, I'm just kind of playing with it. And that's at our Humanities Action Lab. That's the kind of teaching we're going to be incubating in it, is bottom-up. Students deciding what they're going to study, and faculty helping them do it.
Facilitating.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Well, thank you so much.
You're
Is there
welcome.
anything that we didn't touch on that we should have? Covered a lot of ground.
I don't think so. I mean, the one thing that I'm thinking a lot about now is student debt and what it would mean for institutions to really turn that around. Yeah. But I think that's another day's conversation.
Yes, which I recently had with Andrew Ross.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I read somewhere once that somebody figured out that if the City College of New York actually got rid of everybody who does financial aid at City College of New York, they could be free again. They could be free again.
Yes. I feel like that's probably true of Berkeley too, right?
Probably true of, the new school. I mean, it's like we've got so many people who we employ to market, to push paper, to do financial aid, to help people drop out, it's like, God, if we just let people come to school, would that just work? But yes.
That's a good note to end on.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. 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 So much.